Thank you, and thank you for your indulgence, pun intended, for my lateness. It's a perfect storm. Like, when I got here, like right after I got here to the hotel, my phone decided it was going to stop taking a charge. So I'm phoneless, and in these days and age, like, that makes me just lost. And so I got lost on the way here this morning without my GPS. So I apologize. It won't happen tomorrow because now I know every road around here. Welcome. If you weren't here last night, we'll do a little bit of review, and then we'll dig into what we're going to be talking about this morning. Yesterday we talked about what is a Reformation, and if we can see here, is it on? Oh, it's not on. Do I need to push this? Great. So yesterday we talked about what is a Reformation, and today we are going to look through these Reformations just to review what we did yesterday. We took the phrase Semper Reformanda, we broke it down, and came up with a sort of expanded version of this. And by the way, this expanded version, at least the Latin part, there was no real established kind of slogan, Semper Reformanda. It was something that was talked about, tossed around. And many of the folks that use this phrase will add the words ecclesia to it. They'll add some of the words that I mentioned here. So this is not, my speculation. It's dealing with kind of the historical sources and how folks talked about the Reformation, especially in the 19th century. And now this phrase is solidified because in the 20th century it became more of a slogan. But just exploring a little bit about what that means. So God must always be reforming the church. And we made the point that means it's not only for the 16th century, it's not only for the 16th century forward to today, but also extends backwards. God is always about reforming his church. And we looked at a couple Bible verses about Jesus saying, I will build my church and I will send the Holy Spirit. And so this is the true sense of Semper Reformanda, the idea that God is always reforming the church. So then yesterday last night, laid out just a list of things that define what a Reformation is based on the 16th century Reformation. And we saw all these aspects. It really was a comprehensive Reformation, wasn't it? I mean, it was really comprehensive in morals and doctrine and worship, revival, vitality of faith. When we think of Reformation, we talk about Reformation and revival as something that we always need to be seeking. So Reformation should come with revival, vitality of faith, care for the poor. We talked about how frequent communion was a feature, emphasis on preaching and teaching. And I want to point out in one of the conversations I had after the session last night, someone reminded me that the emphasis of the reformers, the Protestant reformers, on education not only included preaching, but catechesis. And they invented catechisms, which if our catechism is a pretty standard list of questions and answers. But if you look at some of the early catechisms, they read like a conversation, and what do you think about this? And the child answers. I'm like, what child can do this? They must have had like super children back then. We have two catechisms, the shorter and the larger. The shorter is designed for children, and the larger for ministers. These days we have the ministers memorize the shorter, and we don't, the larger is just there for historical artifact, I guess. But yeah, they were really serious about catechesis, and they invented catechisms, and I thought that was a good point. And another thing we'll find this morning is that also previous Reformations utilized interesting and new ways of educating, discipling, and catechizing the people. So Evangelism and missions. This good news is going to be accompanied by expanding the church instead of enriching the church from within. Church government, popular groundswell, return to Scripture in the early church. And I also want to point out that this is not a feature of all reformations, but it is a feature of successful ones. This is also a result of a conversation I had after last night. Cooperation of the civil authorities. And we'll talk about that a little bit today, but if it's not a feature of all reformations in history, but the ones that actually take hold and are successful have the support of civil authorities. And I'll play that out a little bit this morning. So if you, I know these are stapled, but I took the staple out, and I'm just going to keep this list of aspects over to the side as we walk through these reformations that we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to basically work through and talk about how each one of these fulfills not all of the list So these are the ones we're going to look at. There's basically a reformation in the church every 2 or 3 centuries back in history. We can start with the Augustinian, the Gregorian, and I'm going to go into these in detail. 6th century, 4th century, 6th century, 9th century, Carolingian, 11th century, Hildebrandian, 13th century, Franciscan, 15th century, Bohemian, and that gets us all from the early church all the way to the Protestant Reformation. So one of the things we're going to be discovering is if we take what we learned last night and apply it to the history of the church, we find that the church is always reforming all throughout its history. So we're going to go through these. This morning, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do a little bit of history. So let's start with the Augustinian Reformation. A little bit about St. Augustine last night. St. Augustine is the teacher of the Western Church. We are Augustinian, and his theology, his approach to worldview, his approach to church, sacraments especially. In the Westminster Confession of Faith, we espouse his view of the sacraments, his designation of how the sacraments work. So we are Augustinian. Even if you've never heard of St. Augustine before, just take my word for it. We are all Augustinian in our thinking. His approach to Scripture, his approach to teaching and preaching. I often say that when you talk about the influence of any figure on the Western church, and even Western civilization, there's Augustine, and everything else is a footnote to Augustine. You cannot overstate his importance. I told you last night how Calvin, in his Institutes, when it lists this ancient citations, there's 9 pages, double column of citations to Augustine. Whenever Calvin has even a minor disagreement with Augustine, he has to apologize. He's almost apologetic that he disagrees with the teacher. So all that to say is Augustine is supremely important, and a lot of our faith and ideas are based off of him. So what happened with Augustine that made a Reformation? Well, this is a historic picture here, and I want you to see a couple things about it. This is not an historically accurate picture. Okay, this is later. It's probably at least Renaissance, probably classical period. But there's a couple things I want you to notice. First of all, he's got a pen in his hand. He wrote a lot. He's got the dress of a pastor. He was a pastor, even though he was very sharp intellectually. He worked as a pastor in a parish from the time that almost from the time he was converted, from about 391 for 40 years. He was a local church pastor for 40 years. You see him with his books, studying the Bible. But this little figure of a heart on fire, that's his emblem. This idea of a heart on fire for God, this idea of vitality, when we look down our list of things, Augustine brings this. He brings vitality of faith, the idea of charity, which is the old way of speaking of love. Augustine is a theologian of love. and he speaks of love and love for God and a heart on fire for God. At the beginning of his confessions, he has this famous phrase, "Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." Has anyone ever heard that before? Yeah, so you can go online and look up free copy of Augustine's Confessions and just read the very first chapter. He says, "You have made us for yourself. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." And the reason why he believed that is because that's true of him. He's almost like a Solomonic character, like the book of Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, everything is vanity. Solomon tried it all. He grew up raised by a Christian mother, but he sort of rejected all that. He thought Christianity was for rustic people, country folk, because the Christians where he grew up in North Africa were kind of rustic country folk. And he's a smart guy. He did not think it was intellectually rigorous to be a Christian. And so he went to university. He became a famous rhetor, which is someone who speaks publicly for a living, which was the ancient world's version of a rock star. He was literally a rock star. And in high demand as a person, as a speaker. And he experienced it all. He had everything life had to offer. And he found it wanting. Also, he pursued all sorts of religions and philosophies looking for the answer. Looking for the answer to the problem of evil. Looking for the answer that would solve his philosophical angst. And he looked 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 until he came back to the answer that was always staring him in the face ever since his mother Monica raised him as a Christian as a little boy, Jesus. And so this is a person whose vitality of faith is given by the testimony of his life. He's not someone who sort of backed into a Christian life or life in the pastorate. He's someone who was taken by God, converted. And so that's why his symbol is a heart on fire. Interestingly enough, a heart on fire is also Calvin's logo. If you've ever seen John Calvin's logo, he adopts Augustine's logo. Should tell you a little bit more about how much Calvin loved Augustine. So vitality of faith, and Augustine becomes a leader in the church at this liminal space, this boundary between ancient Rome and the future. This is when the Germanic tribes were invading. At the end of Augustine's life, he lived long enough to not witness, but be alive for the sacking of Rome. So he knew that Rome was ending. And he wrote this seminal treatise called The City of God, which was giving a vision for a new Christian civilization. And part of his vision was education. So if you look back at your list, emphasis on preaching and teaching and education. He wrote books, not just one, but several books about education and how to educate new Christians and how to build systems of education. So Augustine embodied this idea of vitality of faith, emphasis on preaching and teaching. And of course, as far as return to Scripture in the early church, he kind of still was in the early church, but he exposited Scripture, he expounded Scripture, he preached Scripture. His emphasis was on Scripture. His tractates on the Gospel of John, which is basically sermons, walking through the Gospel of John and all three epistles, is really fascinating, and it's one of the things that I go to when I'm preaching on John. I want to see what Augustine said. He advocated frequent communion and also worship. So participation in worship, music. He took this from his mentor Ambrose, advocating congregational singing, congregational participation. He had his version of the liturgy, which was simpler than the ones that came before it. So really, if you go down the list, so much of what a Reformation is, he embodies. And how is it that he is actually reforming? Well, he's reforming. You could argue that he's forming because he's working with raw material. But the church had been around for about 4 centuries by that point, 3.5 centuries. And we're shifting from this ancient Greco-Roman world to this new world. And so there was a bit of decline, especially where he lived in North Africa. There was a lack of education of the clergy. There was a need for discipleship. And there was this need, as all these new people groups, and we'll see this when we get to Gregory the Great, all these new people groups that are coming in and becoming Christian, there is a need for education and teaching and moral formation. So Augustine embodies all of these things. It may not be a classical Reformation in that he's polemically sort of fighting other folks that have been entrenched in the church, but he is very much embodying all the ideals that we talked about last night. What about doctrine? Okay, this is on this list. So you go to the list that I have. What about doctrine? Augustine did establish a key doctrine, and in this he is similar to Luther. In fact, Luther is really just following in his footsteps. Augustine established what we call the doctrine of grace. And so what we think about grace and predestination and the idea that we are born in original sin, so we're sinful from our conception, that we need grace, that we are baptized as infants, all of this comes from Augustine. And he develops this robust theology of grace. Of course, you're probably saying, well, Paul teaches that. Yes, Paul teaches that. But it's one of those things where we talked about last night how Paul obviously teaches justification by faith alone, but it took 1,500 years before Luther really clearly articulated it. And the same is for Augustine. Paul clearly teaches grace, but it took 350, 400 years before Augustine came around and very clearly articulated grace as opposed to works. And so that would be the doctrinal aspect. So we have a lot to give thanks for in Augustine, and he really sets the stage for the future. So that's the Augustinian Reformation. The next one is the Gregorian, and this is named for St. Gregory the Great. And there's also a key figure here that's a little bit before Gregory the Great, but his name is Benedict of Nursia, or Saint Benedict. This Reformation was really getting more into the post-Roman Empire situation. Gregory was the Bishop of Rome. He was in charge of the church in Rome, but he grew up as a civil ruler, and so he became a priest later in life, a bishop later in life. So he had a lot to do with the administration of the city, as well as the pastoral care for the city, and also making sure that people were fed and clothed. If you've studied the Roman Empire, you know that there were a lot of handouts in the Roman Empire. They basically sustained the populace through, making warfare and pillaging other people groups. That's one of the reasons why Rome kind of fell apart, is it wasn't sustainable. This constant, getting resources from outside. But the folks were in dire need, and Gregory helped provide for that. So when you look at this Reformation, what you have is you have a deteriorating civil society, okay, in the absence of the fall, the deterioration of the Roman Empire. You have the deterioration of civil society. You have, in many ways, the church going along with that. The structures of the church, the leadership of the church is really kind of in need of a strong leader to come on and help reform the church. And here comes Gregory the Great. He was trained as a civil leader. His family was sort of the aristocracy. So he had that administrative side to him, very strong administration side. But then as he grew in his faith, he had this very strong vitality of faith, and his emphasis was on pastoral care. In fact, he wrote a book called The Pastoral Rule, which is a handbook for pastors. And so his emphasis was on pastoral care and on formation. And that's why Benedict is here, St. Benedict of Nursia, because Benedict wrote this thing called the Benedictine Rule, and we could have a whole weekend just on that. But here's a couple of things you need to know about the Benedictine Rule. The Benedictine Rule is it's much more moderate than previous forms of monasticism. It enables those who are engaged in this monastic life to work, to be beneficial. It embodied Augustine's idea of grace, so it was not attempting to earn favor with God, but to live out grace in a life, you might call it intensely lived Christianity. And so the Benedictine Rule enabled this Reformation kind of to take hold, and with respect to the fact that it was able to form people as Christians. And you had a need for a lot of Christian workers. One of the things we take for granted is that we have a lot of time to volunteer for the church. I'm sure all of you probably volunteer a lot for the church. If you're living in early medieval society, you work yourself to the bone from dawn to dusk, and you don't have time to do that. And so they needed a lot of church workers, and the Benedictine Rule and monasticism was sort of the answer to that question. So here you get an army of folks who are praying, who are working, doing church work, evangelism, missions, and they are ordered by this very moderate, grace-centered approach to monastic life that really did do away with a lot of the more severe ascetical versions of the past. It's probably hard for us as Presbyterians to wrap our heads around a good form of monasticism, because we're sort of trained to do the opposite. But this really was a very helpful thing, and Gregory capitalized upon this in order to help reform the church. So what do we see in this Gregorian Reformation? We definitely see a reformation of morals. Gregory was a very moral person and promoted Christian morality. Doctrine, Gregory the Great promoted Augustinian doctrine, and he's one of the reasons why Augustinian comes forward and is so popular, is because Gregory the Great promoted Augustine's teachings on grace. Worship, Gregory promoted congregational singing. If you've ever heard of Gregorian chant, anyone? Okay, he didn't invent it, but it comes about because of him. Now you may say Gregorian chant's not easy to sing. Trust me, if you've seen earlier forms of chant, it is much easier to sing. And it is possible for a congregation to sing psalms, especially according to what we call plain song or Gregorian chant. If you want to get a sense for earlier forms of chant, how complex they were, just get in your head maybe, if you've ever heard someone like a chanting or singing at an Arabic mosque, and how it's really kind of all over the place as far as the flow of the music, and we talked about so many notes per syllable last night. Gregorian is one note per syllable. It's much simpler, much more doable, and Gregory did that. And also with regard to worship, Gregory simplified the liturgy. If you've ever been sitting in church, or getting close to noon, I know you guys start at 9:30, but you know what I mean. But you're getting close to noon, you got your eye on your watch, and your stomach's growling. You have Gregory to thank for the fact that you can get out of church in about an hour and 15 minutes, because he greatly simplified the liturgy. If you compare the Western liturgy to the Eastern liturgy, even today, it's much longer, much more complex. Lots and lots and lots of sitting and standing and back and forth recitation. Gregory just very much simplified it, and he did that for missional purposes, for discipleship purposes. We talked about the intelligibility and the complexity. Like, he really cut through all of that. And one of the things that happened along the way is they lost that. The European church lost that emphasis that Gregory laid down, in becoming more complex and less intelligible, etc. Emphasis on preaching and teach. So we go down this list and we really find all the aspects we're looking for with regard to a reformation. So I think we should look at this as a reformation. And it really, and Gregory's impact is enormous. It really set up the European church to thrive. What about missions? Here's one where we can very clearly see Gregory the Great was really involved in missions and promoting missions. He basically sent missionaries to England. Augustine of Canterbury is one of those. He sent missionaries to England to evangelize England. So the English love Gregory the Great because they consider him to be sort of the emissary for their faith. He also made sure, and this is a little bit of missiology, but I think it's important to note. He made sure that the Christianity that was being spread all over Europe at that time through missions and evangelism, he made sure that it was not simply exporting Roman cultural Christianity. He made sure that Christianity was able to develop contextually in all these different places, and so that you could be an English Christian. You didn't have to become a Roman Christian. You could be an English Christian. You could be a Dutch Christian, a German Christian. The fact that we have so many different Christian Christmas traditions in Europe, if you've ever been to Europe and seen all their different, like some have a Father Christmas and some have a Saint Nicholas and some have a Père Natal, Father Nativity. The reason why, that's a picture of all the different traditions you have in Europe, is because all these cultures were allowed to develop their Christianity along their culture, what they were like. I think it's a beautiful picture of contextualization and mission, and how our goal as missionaries is not to make people American Christians, but Christians in their context. And Gregory did that very well. In other words, he didn't try to make all of Europe into wine drinking, olive oil, olive oil cheese eating Romans, right? He allowed them to be beer drinking, brat eating, butter spreading Germans, we take that for granted, but all of those activities, eating sausages and using butter instead of olive oil, that was considered so uncouth, and backward by the Romans. So, these cultural things we can kind of laugh at, and I laugh. I mean, I told a joke, so of course I think it's funny, but I think we need to sort of take a little pause and think about that, reflect on that, The people that were called the barbarians were called barbarians because they speak a different language. They spoke a different language. Barbar is like it's onomatopoeia. It sounds like what somebody sounds like if they're gibbering, right? Bar blah 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 blah. So barbarian is someone who doesn't speak Latin. Okay, it's a pejorative, and it identifies the other. So the people that we call barbarians, they're just Germans. Okay. If you're of German descent, you're a barbarian, I hate to tell you. Because if you look at Europe, the French are Germans, the Germans are Germans, the Spanish are Germans, the Dutch are Germans, the Northern Italians are Germans, the Germans are, everybody's a German. It's just what kind of German are you? And Gregory really he established this Germanic identity to allow it to flourish. That's really, I think, important. The English are Germans too. I forgot to mention that. The Irish are not Germans; they're Celtic, but that's the exception. Vikings also German. Yes. All right, that's the Gregorian Reformation. Now we come to the Carolingian Reformation. Now we're really getting into the Middle Ages here, the early Middle Ages. And the situation in Europe is where we have all these new Germanic peoples who have now settled in. And some of them have become Christian. Others of them, when we get to the 8th and 9th century, others of them are still pagan. They're worshiping stones and trees and so forth, okay? So you still very much have a situation where you need to focus on evangelization and discipleship. You need to form the church. In the 8th and 9th century, you have a situation where the clergy, once again, are sort of populated by the folks who are from noble families, and they don't have the proper education that they should have. The people don't understand their faith. They're newly converted. to Christianity. They don't have a background for all of this. So there's a big need in the 9th century, again, for a renewal. This Reformation has a name. It was called the Carolingian Renewal. I like to call it Reformation just because I'm sticking with my idea that a semper reformanda idea. I think it embodies all the aspects of Reformation that we've been talking about. So who were these folks? I've got 2 slides, this slide and the next slide. The first slide gives the civil sort of authorities that were involved in this Reformation, and the second slide, sort of the ecclesiastical. So this is kind of a more established, bigger deal. It's pan-European, so I want to spend a little more time talking about it. The Carolingians get their name from a guy named Charles the Hammer. Anybody ever heard of Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer? If you've ever heard of Charles Martel, you've heard about the Battle of Tours in 732, like how he pushed back the invading Muslim horde that was encroaching on Europe. There's a mixture of truth and exaggeration in that. We don't have time to go into it, but if you're interested, ask me after, and I'll be happy to explain it. But these folks were Franks, okay? So what we call France, and they were in the ruling class of the kingdom of the Franks. And you have Charles Martel, his son Pepin the Short, who became king of the Franks. His son Charlemagne, which I think you've heard of. Everybody's heard of Charlemagne, Charles the Great. His son Louis the Pious, and his son Charles the Bald. You basically got 5 generations of rulers of the Frankish peoples who are all Christians, who all supported it to various degrees the reformation of not only their kingdom, but as the kingdom spread, almost all of Europe. So there's a book out there, it's called The Carolingians, the Family Who Forged Europe. And that is true. This is, I call, this era the foundation or the birth of Europe as this new entity that's not Roman, it's German and it's Christian, okay? And this family helped establish that. To varying degrees, they supported mission work, Reformation. I'll just go down this list a little quickly. And then when we get through the Carolingians, I think we'll take a break and I'll let you ask some questions, and we'll have a mental pause, I think, for a second, because I'm kind of giving you the fire hydrant this morning, So Charles Martel is famous for his military victory, of course. That's where he got the nickname Hammer. But also, he supported mission work to the Germans. There's an interesting little feature of history was that by this time, England had really prospered. I told you about Gregory the Great sending Augustine to Canterbury to establish the English church. The later bishops of Rome continued to send really kind of all-stars there to build up the English church. By the time you get to the 8th century and the 9th century, the English church has got the scholarship, they've got the intellectual heft. And so if you're looking for people to come and do Christian work, you go to England to get them. So Charles went to England, got this guy named Boniface. He became Saint Boniface because he was martyred by some of the peoples that he was trying to convert. But Boniface comes from England. He comes back over to Germany and begins to evangelize their long-lost cousins. This is how they framed it. He wrote a letter to the English people saying, now it's our turn to go back to Germany, because remember, the English are Germans, right? So now is our time to go back to Germany, to these Germanic lands, and evangelize and bring Christ to these people who still need the Lord. And so there's waves of missionaries who come from England. They come back into Germanic places, and they evangelize, and they establish the church. And Boniface is on the next slide, so I'll hold that till there. But Charles was influential in bringing those folks over and giving them the protection, because these were militaristic tribes. If you came in and tried to convert them, they would probably, Boniface eventually was martyred. So Martel provided support. He provided protection for these missionaries. His son Pippin, Pepin is the kind of the French way to say it. Pippin is the English way to say it. He reformed the church. He literally had a reformation. There's no problem calling it a reformation. He saw that the church was in need of reformation of morals, of worship, vitality of faith, especially in the education of clergy and how the church was administrated. And so he called reform synods. A synod is a church meeting, a regional church meeting. So he would go place to place and call these reform synods. He'd get all the pastors together and say, look, y'all got to get your act together. Okay? And he would call the synod, get them all together and say, you need to get your act together. You need to reform your church. And they did it. So he went place to place. This idea of calling synods was very successful, and it resulted in the church reforming. The clergy becoming more active and engaged, the people being, church life in the various churches becoming more vital or revitalized, revived, missionary work and education going on to a greater degree. So this Reformation, in fact, was so successful, it started to spread all throughout Europe. So you got your popular Groundswell checkmark. It began to spread as people saw the vitality of faith and how things were thriving in these places. People in other places said, we want that too. In fact, it made its way all the way to Rome, where the people of Rome, by popular demand, the Pope had to call a synod to reform his church. So just gives you a little taste of how influential this was. Pippin also reformed the liturgy, his reformation of worship and singing. And so many of the aspects that we're talking about are there. Charlemagne was his son, and you may have not known that Charlemagne was a dedicated Christian. He was flawed. And when I teach about Charlemagne in my class at the seminary, I take a good bit of time to talk through his flaws and make sure we don't excuse those. But he was a committed Christian. What he adds to the table is he builds on his father's work and reform. He issues this thing called the Admonitio Generalis, which is a general admonition to all of his empire, which is basically most of Europe. And in this declaration, which I call the charter of European civilization, how important it was, he lays down a lot of belief, what people should believe, how the church should be governed, and especially the education of the people. In this document, he lays out that churches should set up schools so that clergy can be educated, so that clergy can educate the people, so that the people understand their faith. So, we talk about the Dark Ages. This idea is pushed against by the fact that they were promoting education. They wanted the people in the pew to understand their faith, to understand the worship service, to understand the prayers. And one of the ways that they educated people in the pews is they used the liturgy. So liturgy as catechesis. And so they would be educated by their pastors on the different parts of the service and how they functioned, the different prayers and what they meant, the Lord's Prayer and what it means. And they were the first to start saying the creed in church. So they used the creed, so everybody would say the creed every Sunday. They would have it memorized. And if you memorize the creed and you can say it, you understand quite a bit about your faith. Now, they did the Nicene Creed, so the long one, They also added a phrase to the creed for the purposes of educating the folks, which we call the filioque, which is that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. So there's your doctrinal reformation. You've got all those aspects there. But as far as the way they catechized the folks, they said they made it a law, Charlemagne specifically. You got to come to church every Sunday, okay? And you got to stay till the benediction. You got to stay to the end. Why? So that you hear the sermon and you receive communion. They emphasized frequent communion by the laity as a means of grace, as a way of uniting all these different peoples together. And so worship was really the central part for them. You get the people together on the Sunday, make sure they understand what the worship service is doing. They understand the theology of the sacraments. They hear preaching and teaching. They recite the creed. They receive the means of grace. And they go home. And they And that's their formation. And if you could do a worship service well and make sure people understand what's going on, that's doing quite a bit. Like I as a pastor, if everybody in the congregation understood the worship service and understand the theology of what was going on, I would consider that quite a success in Christian formation, especially when you don't have a lot of time to do much else. So that's the way they did it. It was through worship and preaching and teaching in the worship service. I thought there was another thing to point out. I could talk about this forever. So Louis the Pious continued to carry out the reform of his father. After his father died, Louis made sure that the things that his father Charlemagne laid out got carried out. He ensured that happened. And Charles the Bald was kind of the Solomon. He's the most educated, kind of very scholarly, and he continued to engage. By this time, people, the clergy and the people were well educated, so they started getting into theological discussions, very deep theological discussions. This is really, you really see the flowering of this Reformation is in some of the activity, the theological activity that happens under Charles the Bald. So that's the civil side. And I just wanted to give you a picture of how civil leaders can influence Reformation. So going to the ecclesiastical side, and there's a whole bunch of people. I'm just hitting the highlights of this. You had a guy named Hadrian who was from Africa. It's an African who was a part of this Reformation in England, who was recruited by the Bishop of Rome, sent to England, and established this world-class educational system in England. And so I like to point that out because when we think of European, think of the Middle Ages, we don't think of multicultural activity. Here's a guy from Africa, Bede, who is the English historian, the Venerable Bede, says he was of the African people. So he comes from Africa, he goes to England, he sets up this educational system, and that fruit comes to bear when Boniface comes over and starts evangelizing and doing his mission work. So Saint Hadrian is not well known, but I always like to point that out because I think it's important for us to get the big picture of God's global church and how it was still really there. Boniface, a couple of cool stories about Boniface. One of the interesting things about Boniface is his legend of how he chopped down the sacred oak. And what probably happened was that the people were being ensnared by idolatry because of this oak. They couldn't, they couldn't get over the sacredness of the oak, and they kept getting pulled back into the worship of this tree. So Boniface comes along with an axe and chops it down. So there's some church work for you, chopping down sacred oaks. Now, probably what he did is he took an axe and he hacked at it for a few hours until it was down, with Martel's troops standing next by to make sure nobody killed him. But according to legend, and I love this story, and it's not true, probably. But according to legend, he took an axe and he hit it one time. It exploded. The tree exploded and made little cross-shaped pieces all over the ground. Maybe that happened. I don't know. It would have been a miracle. Probably he just chopped it down, but that's a good story. So Boniface, as I said, he had a long career. He ended up being called the apostle to the Germans, and he's revered by all German peoples. And he ended up being martyred by the Frisian peoples, which is the lowland people near like Belgium and Holland. So he was martyred there. And that's why we call him Saint Boniface, because he was martyred. Alcuin of York was a church leader who came from England. Okay, so here's another example. And he was sort of the administrative right-hand man of Charlemagne. So a lot of the stuff that happened as a result of Charlemagne's work was really Alcuin's work. So the educational stuff, this innovative idea of using the liturgy and the creed to educate the people, like that's all really from Alcuin. And so he's a great influence. Benedict of Anion was sort of Louis the Pious's right-hand man, and he was involved in really mobilizing monastic folks, remember, go back to Gregory the Great, to do this mission work. So when we think about mission work, we think about, folks like you who feel a call to missions, and somebody comes to a missions conference and says, hey, we need people to go to, Belize or wherever, and some of you sign up and go, Back then, you didn't have that really opportunity because of the way the society was. And so the way the Carolingians did it is they made these monasteries. They would plant monasteries in places where they wanted to evangelize. Okay, then they took the long view. They would start educating the native boys so that in 20, 30 years they could have indigenous leaders of the church. That's how they did it. And one of the things they did is they actually purchased slaves out of slavery, educated them in their schools, and then that could be the next generation of leaders in the church. So that's pretty revolutionary. They came up with that, and it worked. It worked. So the European school system, as we know, was established, really has its roots in the Carolingians, because they said every monastery and every church should have a school. And if you look back at like the University of Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, that's how they all started, was monastic and what we call palace schools. Pascasius Radbertus was someone who wrote about the Lord's Supper. He was the first person to write a book about the Lord's Supper, and so he's influential theologically because he helped develop the theology of the for them. Okay. And we're about halfway through. So I'll pause for questions. You guys any thoughts or questions? Did we take a little pause here? Yes.
You highlighted all the positive things that have been going along with these various reformations. I just wonder, what were the negatives that up to, say, Martin Luther and Calvin and others?
Sure, yeah. It's a good question. One of the reasons why I like going through history this way is it shows us, like, imagine a sine wave. It shows us there's this pattern in the history of the church, and it's pretty well definable, to where you have an era of fervency, vitality, reform. The church thrives, it grows, and then they get used to it. And then it goes down. And then people wake up and say, hey, someone pointed out, isn't this like Israel? In a lot of ways, it is like ancient Israel, right? Because especially when you come to the book of Judges, right? It's like the book of Judges where people, the judge comes along and they repent and they start thriving, and then the judge dies and, we're okay, and every blah, blah, blah. And then the morals creep, worship degenerates, they get in trouble. Oh God, we need you. Okay, here we go up the sine wave again. That pattern, one of the reasons why I'm doing this is it shows you this pattern has always been there. Every 200-300 years, you have a period where people get strong in their faith, they reform the church, they're on fire for God, and then when they have that success, they start to think it's because of them, and then they inevitably start declining. And so part of the job that we have to do is figure out what point are we on the wave. And one of the reasons why Semper Reformanda is so important is because we really should never get complacent. That's why that's a good theme. That if we're never complacent and we're continually looking to reform ourselves, our churches, then maybe we won't have that drop off, And another consistent feature is that in all these reformations, everybody thought that they'd finally arrived. So if you think, we're not susceptible to this, we're a Presbyterian church in America, like that also is a constant of history, is that everybody else also thought that would never happen to them. So to your question, basically what you had in the late Middle Ages is another one of these downturns where the church got really successful and fruitful based on the next two reformations I'm going to talk about. And it got very wealthy, and the upper leadership began to be basically just very immoral. Leadership was, it was not shepherds. There were not shepherds leading the church. They were business people. They were warriors. They were just out for money and fame and power. And so when that degenerates, the leadership of the church degenerates, the rest of the church goes with it. And so people were basically involved in church work for money. You know, they bought and sold positions. I mean, there's this problem in the late medieval church called simony. Simony is named for Simon Magus, the guy who tried to pay Peter for the Holy Spirit in the book of Acts. Literally, bishoprics would be bought and sold. Church positions would be bought and sold. If they didn't pay enough, you would accumulate. So let's say my pastor job doesn't pay enough. I'm going to try to get the next town over, and maybe I can have 3 or 4 of those, and then I'll get paid enough. And then I'll hire somebody for pennies to do the work. And that's where we get the term vicar, if you know that term. That's where that comes from. A vicar is someone who does the church work for somebody else who's got the actual position. So all of this sort of that downward slope with it's not nobody. People would stand up and say, this is not right. And we'll talk about this. We'll get into it. But it just keeps going down until people start saying, no, we can't do this anymore. And then it ticks up, right? And if you move forward from the Reformation, let's go to England. Yeah, the Evangelical Revival in England, right? The 18th century Evangelical Revival, the Wesleys and Whitfield and all. Well, that's about 100 years, 150 years from the Reformation, you know? So you just continue to have that, right? You have the Great Awakening here in the United States. You know, you have the revivals of the 1950s, you know, after World War II. So this just keeps happening, right? So I guess what I'm trying to sort of move us away from is the idea that the 15th century was unique in its depravity. It wasn't. I mean, it was bad, and the church needed a really comprehensive reform, and it was right to reform. But yeah, does that help? That's a great question. Did I see another hand? Okay, we'll do one more. Yes, sir. Yes, it comes from Charles the Martel. Yeah, so Carolus, Charles in Latin is Carolus. So Carolingian literally means like of the family of Charles. So if you've ever seen The Matrix, you may have heard the term Merovingian. You ever heard the term Merovingian? No, okay. Nobody seen The Matrix? Yeah, that's okay. Well, there's this mystical character in The Matrix called the Merovingian. The Merovingians were a clan of rulers of the Franks before the Carolingians, and their forebear was named Merovec. So that's of the clan of Merovec. Anyway, just an etymological thing. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, back to Saint Benedict. So he was going on and getting teaching the neighbors, and then they would. That's simple. In fact, we do that.
I think, you know, take the vows of celibacy out, take the sort of monasticism, strict monasticism part. I think you do have in some of these modern mission movements a lot of similarities with some of these earlier groups. Well, yeah, but there is slavery in some parts of the world, so. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, let me clarify. When I said they bought slaves, they bought and freed them. They didn't keep them as slaves. I should have clarified that. They basically went to the slave markets, they purchased these people and set them free, you know, and then trained them in their schools. So they did not keep them as slaves. I left that part out. Yeah, and that way they were subversive to the institution of slavery even back then. Okay, we've got 3 more reformations to look at, so let's do that. The next one is called Hildebrandian, and I just had to keep with this Ian Reformation, kind of Carolingian, Hildebrandian, Franciscan. So this is named for a person whose birth name was Hildebrand, but he later became Pope Gregory the Seventh. Now, this Reformation is in here because it's important. It's very influential. Also, it is one of the reasons why that so many of the things that we reformed in the Protestant Reformation happened. So maybe this gets back to your question, sir, about how did these things happen? Gregory the Seventh and their answer for the problems in Europe resulted in clerical celibacy, increased papal authority, asceticism is sort of the answer to immorality. Like many of the things that we associate with maybe the late medieval church were brought about during this Reformation, and in ways that I think we should be critical of. So this one I'm not presenting because I think it's wholly good. In fact, there's a lot to criticize about it, but I'm presenting it because it meets a lot of our criteria. But the answers that they had to solve the problem had a lot of unintended consequences. Okay? So let's talk about this for a minute. Gregory the Seventh was a bishop of Rome. He was a pope. And St. Bernard, you may have heard of St. Bernard. I talked about him last night. That's whom the dog breed is named after. And the hymn, O Sacred Head Now Wounded, he wrote that. St. Bernard was a monastic leader, okay? Critical of the papacy, very strong in his Augustinian theology of grace. And the reason why he's here is because you had a couple of different problems here in the 11th century. You had a problem of clerical morality, lack of education, okay? If you have problems with clerical immorality, pastors not being moral people, then you're going to have problems with the people and that they're pastoring not being moral. So this is all trickling down. The monasteries it started out as missional super centers, right? We're running schools, we're evangelizing. Well, over time they became places of wealth and opulence and not really engaged in the ministry of the church. So St. Bernard is a monastic reformer, reforming the monasteries, getting them back to their original mission of prayer and service. He's very critical of the papacy. That's why Calvin liked him a lot. That because he was a very strong Augustinian in his theology of predestination and grace. But Hildebrand is the main person who drives the European church toward what it looks like, what we think of. So before him, this idea of papal supremacy didn't exist. Like he kind of invented this. The idea that the Pope is, not that the Pope was the first among equals. That existed before. The idea that the Bishop of Rome was in the seat of Peter, that existed before. But the idea that the Pope was supreme, that his word was law, Gregory invented it. And he invented it on a forged document called the Isidorian Decretals. You don't really need to know what those are. But basically, they gave him, he felt, the theological impetus to write this thing called the Dictatus Papae, which is the dictates of the Pope. And if you read this thing, it'll really open your eyes because the things that he says in there, like, it's basically the Pope's word is law. If you're not in communion with the Pope, you're not a Christian. Like all this stuff that we tend to think of as Roman Catholic, like he invented it in the 11th century. And he invented it because his answer to the problem, the need for reformation, was to increase the authority of the Bishop of Rome. That was his answer. He thought, well, if we can increase the authority of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, then the Pope can keep the church in line. That was his idea. And it worked for a while. But what happened later? You got a powerful position. What kind of people want to be in that position? Unscrupulous, immoral people want to be in that position. So by the time you get into the 15th and 16th century, you've got the Borgia family who is in control of the papacy. They don't have a spiritual bone in their body. So unintended consequence, right? And it's a lesson here of if you try to reform the church through authoritarian measures, it doesn't work. It may work for a little while, but over time it leads to a cult, basically. So what I want to point out is there was a real problem, and Gregory was a genuine Christian whose his solution was to increase the authority of the Pope. Now, we can look back and rightly criticize that. And I think that's the main thing that we should criticize about the late medieval church is the over-influence of the papacy. There's nothing biblical or I'm going to use the word Catholic, but universal. There's nothing biblical or universal in the tradition that says the Pope gets that power. That was invented by Gregory to his fault. He also didn't invent, but made normal clerical celibacy. Before that, in fact, after that, priests could be married. Some priests were married. They had kids. Some of the popes were grandkids of popes, and it wasn't because of immorality. It's because they were married. Gregory the Great, who was a pope, his granddad was also a pope. So the idea that priests should not be married was something that Gregory really pushed in the 11th century to combat the problem of the immorality of the clergy. His idea was if we just remove marriage and sex from the equation of pastors altogether, then we can just take that out of the equation. Now, obviously, we look back on that and say that was wrong. It did not accomplish what it intended to accomplish. But again, I want to point out that was a genuine need. It was a genuine solution that he came up with. But I think it's fascinating to point out, and hopefully you think it's fascinating too, that clerical celibacy was not the norm until the last part of the Middle Ages. Okay? To the latter part of the Middle Ages. And it was because of Gregory. So we have papal power and clerical celibacy. Basically, what he wanted to do, he was an ascetical type monk, very ascetical. He wanted to make all the clergy into ascetical type people. So that's him. So we find along our list, there's reform of morals, there's new doctrines, especially doctrine of the papacy, doctrine of ecclesiastical doctrines, revitalization of worship, vitality of faith. You go down the list and they're all there. But I bring this one up to say, look, the solutions were not good, and they didn't really benefit the church in the long term. Pope Innocent III is here. He's on a couple of my slides, but he's here because he really codified in the Fourth Lateran Council the program of Gregory and brought it forward. So Gregory, had these ideas. He wasn't really successful by the end of his life. Innocent III was a very powerful and able administrator, very, very, very strong leader. He calls this council, ratifies all these ideas, and that's how they really took shape in the church. One of the things that Pope Innocent did is he really emphasized education. So it's not all bad. The Council of Lateran IV has a lot of good things in it. Education of the clergy and the people, emphasis on pastoral care, so actual, making sure that the pastors were caring for the people's spiritual needs. Like that some very needed stuff in that document. But again, just pointing out, if you're looking for how the church went off the rails in the late medieval period, that's where I would point to. A whole list of unintended consequences. By strengthening papal authority, top-down authoritarian leadership, and this whole idea of celibacy or purity culture that became a norm as a way to combat sexual immorality. Okay? So that probably helps you a little bit, huh? Yeah, okay. I'm glad. All right. Now, the opposite of the Hildebrandian in many ways is the Franciscan Reformation. If the Hildebrandian is top down, it's increased the authority of the Pope, it's using power and authority to reform the church, the Franciscan is the opposite. Franciscan is the idea of self-renunciation, of denial, of following Christ, of being the least of these. Francis is famous for preaching to the birds, not because he literally thought he should preach sermons to birds. It was a living kind of prophetic action, showing that even the tiniest creatures matter. And this is a way of kind of showing and teaching that really the way of Christ is the way of the cross. It's the way of humility, being humble. It's not the way of the opulence of the papacy. So Francis comes along, again, another couple hundred years later after Bernard and Hildebrand, and you still kind of got the same problems. You got an aristocracy. If you want to think, early 13th century, Romeo and Juliet, like this is, the Italian kind of situation of Romeo and Juliet, where we've got a lot of if you haven't read that Shakespeare play, I mean, that's what he's trying to imbibe. So you've got aristocracy, they've got a lot of leisure time, they've got a lot of wealth, they're fighting sword duels in the streets, that sort of thing. And so you've got the same situation. The churches are in disrepair. The clergy are not educated the way they need to be. The people have lost their way, this top-down way of reforming the church. Well, it did make a lot of rules that people felt obligated to keep, but it didn't really engage their hearts, right? So we're in need of an Augustinian revival, the heart on fire. And here comes Francis, the little poor man who was one of those, aristocratic type sword dueling guys, but who had a radical conversion to Christ. And I think that the Franciscan Reformation, it really was a revolution, is probably the most important one leading up until the Protestant Reformation, and has had the most influence on popular culture of any of them, maybe Luther, but I think Francis more than Luther. Francis is an enduring figure because he is so humble, and he's like the opposite of a self-aggrandizing leader, So what did he promote? He promoted, if we look down our list of Reformation stuff, reform of morals, sure, but we're going to be moral. We're going to live moral lives out of love for God and for His kingdom. Reform of doctrine and worship, yeah, Francis promoted church attendance. He promoted frequent reception of the Lord's Supper. He encouraged the clergy. He was not himself ordained, but he encouraged the clergy to get their act together, to clean up their churches that were literally filthy. Imagine if you came to church and there were like rats running around, and the communion chalice was dirty. You wouldn't want to. It would not be enticing to participate in. That's the kind of situation they had. Care for the poor, certainly. Francis is all about care for the poor and for the sick and the lame. Evangelism and missions and popular groundswell, certainly. This was a very popular movement. And it was basically a movement about a few things. Number one was the opulence and power of the top leadership. So Francis is prophetically embodying this way of poverty, not because you have to be poor in order to be saved, but as a way to speak out and be critical of how the top of the church had lost its way. Francis has had an enormous impact. I always ask these questions in my church history class. I always say, which one of you has ever heard of Innocent III or Gregory the Seventh? Anybody? How many of you have heard of St. Francis? Everybody, right? I mean, he's got a hymn in our Presbyterian hymnal. All creatures of our God and King. That's an enormous impact. And I think he's someone that we could really learn a lot from. I want to point out Peter Waldo. Who's ever heard of Waldo or the Waldensians? Some of us. The Waldensians were a reform movement in the Piedmont of the Alps, Italian Alps. So think of secluded villages and valleys and things like that. Waldo and Francis were not much different at all. They were both men of their age. They were both men that were sick of the opulence of the church and the decline of church life, They both articulated the same kinds of things: care for the poor, reception of the Lord's Supper, education of the people. And the Waldensians were persecuted, but the Franciscans were not. Do you know why? Because Francis had friends in high places, and Peter Waldo didn't. There's really no discernible difference between the two of them. Now, Francis was more of an institutional guy. Yes, he didn't do a hard break with the church. But the Waldensians are very similar to the Franciscans. And do you know, when the Reformation happened and people started, in later years started immigrating to the United States, the Waldensians still existed in the Piedmont, in those valleys in the Italian Alps. When they came to America, do you know what the Waldensians became? Presbyterians. They became Presbyterians. So there's Presbyterian churches, Waldensian churches in North Carolina especially. There's a few of them that still exist today. So I find that pretty fascinating. We can trace some of our roots, if you make those little connections, all the way back to this Reformation in the 13th century. That embodies a lot of the stuff that we care about. One of the things that St. Francis and Waldo too emphasized was the goodness of creation. So part of the problem with the worldview that was being embodied by the church at that time was that basically, the flesh is evil, the world is evil, we have to shun that stuff in order to be holy. Francis said, no, the created world is good. We have the canticle of creation, all creatures are of our God and King. That's why he preaches to the birds, is recognizing that the birds are part of God's good creation. If you know any Franciscan friar, when you think of friar, who's the first one that comes to mind? Friar Tuck, right? And what is Friar Tuck? I'm thinking of the Disney, let's go to the Disney Robin Hood, the one with the foxes, and the Friar Tuck is like a badger. What is Friar Tuck like? Well, he's rotund, okay? So he obviously enjoys creation, right? What else is he like? Is he among the people? Yeah, he's with the people. He gets arrested with them. He's in prison with them. Does he stand up to authority? Just get the image of him bouncing the sheriff out with his belly out of the church. You get out of my church. He's caring for the poor. That's a model, and Disney got that right, by the way. That's a model of a Franciscan, right? With the people, suffering with the people, standing up to authority, preaching the good news, caring for the poor. That's the embodiment of this Reformation, and it's so much more refreshing than this sort of like fundamentalistic top-down way of doing Reformation in churches. So I think we find ourselves in a moment in America where we have to make a decision. Are we going to more embody the Hildebrandian way, the way of innocent, the sort of let's tackle things with laws and rules and power, or are we going to take the way of Francis and be Christ to people, suffer with people, serve with people, renounce our position? That's a decision that we're going to have to make. I think we're in that moment right now. That's not an easy decision to make. All right. So, we have we're getting close to the Reformation, okay? And I've got two more slides, basically. We've got the pre-reformers, and I want to first talk about the Bohemian Reformation. The Bohemian Reformation occurred in the 15th century, so right before the Reformation. And it was in Bohemia, so Prague mainly, the city of Prague. And it was led by, the main leader was a guy named Jan Hus, so we call him John Huss. And the Hussites, the Moravians, or the descendants of those folks. And Huss comes along and he does the same exact stuff that Reformations have done for 1,000 years. He's emphasizing vernacular preaching. Huss was a preacher. In fact, they wouldn't let him preach in a regular church, so he found the biggest lot in town and built basically a church all around the edges of the block, so he could build the biggest church he could possibly build. And and if you've ever been to Prague, they have it still. It's this weird-shaped thing, as big as they could make it, so as many people could come and hear his preaching as possible. He was preaching in the vernacular. He was doing the worship in the vernacular. He was emphasizing frequent communion. He was caring for the poor. He was the one who said, no, we've got to give the cup back to the laity because the cup of communion had been taken away. Education, reform, speaking truth to power. He was very critical of the papacy. Everything you have in Martin Luther, you have in John Huss. Everything. The only difference is that Luther had Frederick the Wise, who kept him from being arrested and martyred, and Huss didn't have that. So Huss was condemned to death in 1415 at the Council of Constance. He was burned at the stake. And that was really kind of, you might say, the embers that really lit the Reformation, because that was an atrocity. Someone who was trying to reform the church. Huss was greatly influenced by the English theologian John Wycliffe. We've heard of Wycliffe, right? Because he translated the Bible. Well, he did more than translate the Bible. He also had he was very critical of the papacy and the upper church leadership, especially critical of this new doctrine called transubstantiation, which was brand new at that time. And so Huss was building on the teachings of Wycliffe and reforming the church in Bohemia. Now, what is interesting about this is basically just about 100 years ahead of the curve. Because what you have break out in the 16th century is the exact same thing. Local reformations. Just local places where people are fed up and they start reforming the church. Zwingli said, I've been preaching the gospel for 30 years before I heard of Martin Luther. Zwingli did not claim that he was following Luther. So he was reforming the church in Basel. Farel was reforming the church in Geneva. Luther was reforming the church in Wittenberg. Butzer was reforming the church in Strasbourg. Thank you. Cranmer was reforming the church in England. And Huss was reforming the church in Bohemia just 100 years before. And he didn't have the backing of anyone who protect him from being martyred. So this brings us to this topic of pre-reformers. If you've ever studied the Reformation, you probably heard of the pre-reformers. Has anybody ever heard of the pre-reformers? A few of us? Now, typically, if you read a history book, it's said to be four guys: Waldo, Wycliffe, Huss, and Savonarola. We've already talked about Waldo, Wycliffe, and Huss, right? Savonarola is interesting. I don't think he really qualifies. I always wonder why his name is thrown in there. I think because he was critical of the Pope, but he's not a Protestant by any stretch. In fact, he wrote the second verse of the Hail Mary. That's not Protestant at all. But this is the typical narrative. You've got these pre-reformers, these four guys. They're called Wycliffe is the morning star of the Reformation and so forth. What I'm presenting to you is it's better, I think, to think of these as just reformers. Because we've seen there's Reformation every 200-300 years all throughout history. So does Waldo, is he really a pre-reformer? No, he's just a reformer in the Italian Piedmont that was like 300 years before the Reformation. There's no connection from Waldo to Luther. Now, there is one from Huss to Luther, but Huss was just doing his thing in Bohemia, just like Luther was doing his thing in Saxony, just like Zwingli was doing his thing in Basel. So I think we should think of these as not as pre-reformers, but as reformers, and we stick with our idea that the church is always reforming. And we see these folks as faithful leaders in the church which have always been present and existing. If you've got your handout, you get a better image of this. This is a really cool picture. This is basically what we call the chain of events. This is Wycliffe, and he's making a spark with a flint, like this. And then we have Huss, and he's taking that spark and lighting a candle. And then we have Luther, and now he's got a torch. So the idea is that Wycliffe made a spark, Huss kind of took that spark and made a little flame, and Luther. This is from a Moravian hymnal, and it is celebrating the legacy of John Huss, but also pointing out that Wycliffe kind of started it all. So I think that's a really cool image. And you can see the musical notation over here to the side that they had. So that's all I have today. The historical reformations of the church and the idea that the church has always been reforming. Yeah, so let's bring it forward. Yeah, what about it? What do you guys think? Where are we at? Where do we need to go? I mean, this is, I have, but we have this popular groundswell. Okay, this is kind of where we all come in. Where do you, if we place ourselves in all these different things last night, where are we at? I already alluded to the fact that I think that we're at a pretty important moment. Post-Christianity, post-Christendom. So how are we gonna react to that as Christians? Are we gonna try to keep our power and influence and authority, or are we gonna take a different path? Yes, sir.
I think that you mentioned this last night. When you look at a lot of churches today, music now has become performance, not congregational singing. A lot of sermons tend to be topical, so you have this less of
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you could point out to some of the consumeristic aspects of modern church worship and life as really kind of hearkening back to an earlier day, and how Reformation ideals of participation, intelligibility, preaching the word, those are still very important, and I think by and large this is one of the reasons why I became a Reformed Presbyterian is we still embody that, but just understanding even more like how can we even more embody that like what we learned about the Carolingians with worship and education of using liturgy as formation. I think that's a fascinating idea because we tend to think of liturgy as experiential. Worship is experiential. And I think it should be. I don't think it should be like, I'm sitting on a pew like a disembodied mind blob that's cold and unimpassioned. I think worship should involve feelings, but it should also be formative, instructive. So, yeah. So.
What about the mainline denominations that are sort of straying away from Scripture?
Yeah, so obviously, I think this is now where you're asking me to be a prophet instead of a historian, which I'm fine to put on that hat, but it seems to me like they're going away, right? And so where we find ourselves in a Presbyterian church, a conservative Presbyterian church, this legacy that I've talked about. Got all this great stuff in our past that we can build on, that the reformers didn't do away with, did not shy away from the best of the traditions of the church. Okay, and that's another one of the things that holds us fast to Orthodox teaching is that long trajectory, and in many ways the mainline churches have rejected that trajectory. Because you don't have anything in the history of the church that leads you toward the ordination of women as pastors or the acceptance of homosexual practice or any number of things that they have kind of gone down the wrong side of. So, what seems to me is that is dying, and we have an opportunity to decide if we can move from kind of the embattled conservatives to the really outward-facing, mission-minded. We think of mission fields as somewhere else, right? I'm going to go on mission. Where are you going? South America, I'm going to Africa, I'm going to Asia. Well, probably need to start thinking of our own backyard as a mission field, right? The Eastern Shore is your mission field. And kind of what Francis helps us do is maybe okay, we don't really need to be the embattled conservatives anymore. We kind of won that. The main lines are going away. We can kind of stretch our wings a little bit and be the kind of confident, mission-minded folks who really aren't afraid to reach out, to others. And so that's where I think we are, But it's really hard, though, to jettison that sort of embattled conservatism, because we're just used to fighting. We've fought for things our whole life, and it's natural to continue that fight. Here's a story. There have been Christians in the Middle East, Egypt, Middle East, Iraq, all those places. They've been Christians there the whole time, right? They exist all the way back to the time of Jesus. The Apostle Paul was in Antioch. That's Syria. That's a Middle Eastern place, right? Was that? So my point is that there have been Christians there, but they've been embattled and defensive for 2,000 years. And so they are distrustful of the Arabic people around them because they've killed them. They've persecuted them. So it's natural. But now that obviously the Spirit, I don't know if you've read reports, the Spirit is apparently moving in these countries, and people are converting to Christ left and right. The old churches that have been there for 2,000 years are really struggling to open up because they've just been embattled for so long. And it's new mission movements that are coming in and bringing in the Christians. So that's an illustration, I think, of where we find ourselves, not to that great extent, but I think what we need to do is realize we won the war, conservative liberal war. We won that. Praise God. That thing is dying. And now we can kind of stop fighting that and open up and really kind of be able to receive new people into the church and figure out what that means. So that's what I think. Yeah. Good question. So a lot of them were built in different eras. I'm trying to think of when the vast majority of them were built. There was a Gothic period that really that was, 13th, 14th century. So Westminster Abbey, for example, dates back to the 13th century. So that period of time is when you have a lot of stuff going on. You do have this sort of renewal, this top-down renewal, and I guess it makes sense that these great gods with their high ceilings and their grand view of God correspond to, and also a very, even though they're beautiful, I love would all with an elevated papacy and like those kind of go together, right? Big churches and a very lofty view of leadership and government. That's an interesting question. I have never thought of like you're intending to ask. Architectural movement fit with logically, I think. Yeah. I haven't done a ton of thought on the fly, but there's true and beautiful about the grandeur of God that architecture exhibits, right? And if any of us has ever walked into one of those churches, it's breathtaking. Here's an interesting kind of side point. Westminster Abbey kind of pre-existed the Gothic movement, and so it was created before that. And the original artwork and architecture actually has a more, I know it's hard to believe because it's a huge, huge church, but it had more of a homey feel to it that was then augmented in the later Gothic era. And a lot of the artwork, which was very kind of, much more warm and inviting, was whitewashed over and replaced with a more austere look. St. Paul's Cathedral in London, that place is like it's just big and cold and granite. Even Westminster Abbey still feels warmer even after they made those changes. I mean, I don't know what to do with that, but I think it's a really good question. Yes, sir. Yeah, so it's a great question. The bubonic plague, it was a rolling plague. It was, over many years, but it was pretty intense in the 14th century. You had massive depopulation. I mean, a lot of people died. So the church is really wrestling with, in a lot of ways, with that post-plague identity, and I think that's what leads to a lot of the reform movements in the later part of the Middle Ages, is people really kind of wrestle with life and death in a way that they hadn't in a long, long time, on a big scale, and maybe the inability of the church power to keep them out of a situation like that, So I think that what you have in the later Middle Ages and people wrestling with apocalypticism, which was a big thing, and this move toward reform is absolutely related to the aftermath of the bubonic plague. Yeah, so connecting apocalypticism, you got a lot of people dying. This seems like the end of the world, right? So because it seems like the end of the world, you got this movement to eschatologically to get toward this golden age of Christ returning, and so then that moves people to want to reform the church, get right with Jesus, so to speak, on a grand scale. I think it's all sort of related. That's a great observation. Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Yeah, a little bit. That's a great question. So I've largely ignored the Eastern Church. There's a couple reasons for that. Number one is that the Eastern Church is pretty much cemented in the 4th century. It's like you froze it in time. Liturgically, they still use the Liturgy of Chrysostom and St. They translate it into English if you go to a service here in America. But really, if you want to see what the church looked like in the ancient times, just go to an Eastern Orthodox service, because it's really kind of frozen in time. Very little congregational participation, and the liturgy is just very ornate liturgy, very long liturgy. So the short answer is they don't change a lot. Now, the reason for that is because we haven't talked about this, but the Roman Empire continued to exist in the East until the 15th century. So they had a lot more political stability, right? So this relationship between the Roman Empire continued for 1,000 years, and then you've got these sort of these other branches of the Eastern churches which kind of off of that, and so they didn't change a lot. The other thing is the East and the West were largely cut off from each other because of Islam. Basically, if you think of Europe, so Spain, Italy, and here's Europe, and here's Africa, Asia, Middle East. Basically, Islam forms like a crescent that kind of blocks Europe off from the rest of the world. So they had very little contact with the East. And in fact, this is an interesting thing, I think, anyway. When Western theologians and scholars began to rediscover Aristotle in the 13th century as a philosophy, they discovered it through Arabic writings. I mean, Aristotle was a Greek guy, but they had zero interaction with Greek writings. They rediscovered Aristotle through Arabic texts. They discovered mathematics, Greek mathematics, through Arabic texts. They discovered Greek medicine, like the Hippocratic Oath, that guy, through Arabic texts. So literally there was like a shield between the East and the West, and there was very little interaction. I did say there was something to it, though. There was an interesting interaction between Martin Luther and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So the reformers were very keen to find an ancient sort of way to attach what they were doing, their reform, to ancient times. Maybe they could have benefited from my lecture. They would have been able to say, hey, we've been doing this every 200 years, you know. They tried to do that. But Luther, interestingly enough, had an emissary from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church visit because he felt that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the ancient faith in the way that they weren't definitely anything to do with the Pope. They didn't like the Pope. And they preserved this ancient faith and liturgy and adherence to the gospel that they could partner with. I found that fascinating, because you have an Orthodox church, indigenous African Orthodox church, and Luther's like, hey, we're going to get with you guys and hitch our wagons together. Now, for one reason or another, it didn't materialize. It probably had to do with just the economic and political realities of what was going on in Europe. I mean, they got into a 30 Years' War because of the emperor decided he was going to fight, so that probably put a damper on things. But so there was very little connection, but there was some. Does that help? Yep. Yes, sir.
Speaking of the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, what do you say is kind of going on now with people who get fed up with evangelical Protestantism and are now converting to those?
Right. Well, first thing is that's been happening for about 40, 50 years. I mean, there was a big wave of people that were involved in Campus Crusade for Christ back in the 80s, and they did that. This is what I think is going on. The first thing that's going on is that people are searching for an anchor, right? And they're wrestling with modernity and post-modernity, and they are listless, in a sea without an anchor. Because basically what our philosophical worldview has done to us, modern Western people, is first of all, it told us that we could find certainty through science, right? And now we find out that there's not any certainty in science. And so now people just don't know what to do, where to go. And so they're looking for an anchor. They're looking for a philosophical, epistemological anchor, and they're finding it. They're trying to find it in this ancient roots of tradition. So this mystical thing appeals to people, this otherworldliness. Like, well, if I can't depend on empirical data, then maybe I should be more mystical, and I open my heart and my life up to the spiritual realm. And especially Eastern Orthodoxy really appeals to that mystical side of things. And a lot of people that go that direction because they're looking for something otherworldly. People that tend to convert to Roman Catholicism do so because they're looking for the true church. I need to find the true church. They're looking for an answer to the moral ambiguity that's all around them, and they find it in the magisterium, the teachings of the church that go back to Jesus and the apostles. Right? So I think that's why people are doing that. And so part of what I'm trying to do is say, look, the church that we inhabit, so our church is an heir of the Reformation churches. We inhabit a branch of the true church. There's no reason. I have this article out there. It talks about, and I often say this, you don't need to become Catholic because you already are. All right? And so part of the thing that we need to do, I think, is Reformed Christians, people are looking at these other traditions to say, look, you already have that anchor. And we need to continue to talk about our connectedness to the church and to its tradition and the ways that we inhabit vital and living and traditions that have been through history, that we're a part of that, and that we have a connectedness. Our church's roots are in Scotland and England and really kind of, theologically in Geneva, and those churches were churches that existed before the Reformation. Like they became They just continue to exist. Those churches were reformed. So our roots continue to go back into medieval and apostolic times. It's a falsity to say that the Roman Catholic, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow in Sunday school. It's a falsity to say that the Roman Catholic Church is the true church that existed from Peter to now. I'm going to expose that myth tomorrow. So I think a couple of things. I think we need to educate folks on the history of the church and let them know that, hey, this is a myth, and this is a myth that the Roman Church is the true church, and it's also not true. It's also true that you already are a part of that tradition. And so we need to embrace that history, that lineage. It's a part of it. Does that help? Yeah. So that's what I try to do. I try to present. Also, all the stuff about the papacy, like I hope you saw that the papacy was kind of invented in the 11th century. Like, it doesn't go back any further than that. At least the papacy as we know it. Yes, ma'am.
So, kind of a two-part thing. So the synods and councils, are they like kind of the same thing, or so
Mm-hmm.
after, because back then you didn't have communication, anything like what you have now, like after a synod or a council, like how soon would they be able to implement
Right.
those things throughout? Although that, maybe would look like to us now as a smaller area,
Mhm.
it's very large because of the communication issues.
Right.
So, did that implement right away, or how would they do that?
It would take time, but not as long as you think. So a council is what we call basically a very large gathering. Ecumenical councils, the whole world. So there were 7 ecumenical councils at the beginning of the church, and they were supposed to be everybody in the world coming. A synod is regional. And the way that they would do this is, the way that Pippin did it is he would go from place to place and hold these synods. So that he would gather the church together in the local place and hold the synod, and then they would do it. And then he'd go to the next place.
Okay, so that's why they're over like 20 years.
Yeah. So they're literally traveling around in order to implement this stuff. And then so with the Admonitio Generalis, then what they did, they wrote it down and they sent it out by written text. But they sent people out as emissaries to all the various places to deliver the message and make sure that things were being implemented. So it had a more human network instead of a... Yeah. It's also make sure that things are done. You got someone showing up saying, oh, are you doing this? All right. Well, I'm getting tired, so I probably need to quit. But what we're going to pick up with tomorrow is we've talked about reformations through history. We've kind of established what is a Reformation. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about the medieval roots of the Reformation, and I'm going to do a little bit of myth busting, and so hopefully that'll be fun. You ever seen Mythbusters before? Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of that, bust a few myths about the medieval church and the Reformation, and that's what we'll do during Sunday school tomorrow. Okay. Everybody for coming again. Let me close this with prayer, and then Father, it's amazing to consider what you've done to constantly reform your church to bring us to where we are today, desperate for you, desperate for King Jesus. And I pray that you work on our hearts and minds to know how we can be missionaries around us, so that we know how to love our world well and promote your gospel well, even as you're about the business of promoting the gospel. Bless us throughout the rest of today, and remind us to turn our thoughts back 1 hour. For the sake of King Jesus, we pray. Amen. Very seriously, you get an extra hour of sleep tonight. If your phone is dead, you may need to manually
Well, I was going to say, I really need that reminder because my phone is dead.
We will have worship regularly tomorrow morning at 9:30, and then, as Dr. LaFleur said, at 11 o'clock,